Hello everybody and welcome back to the Testing Grounds. Short video today just to address some questions that I got in the comments regarding heat sources because it applies to how we did our build on the sour gas refinery condenser boiler. The easy solution is to have a volcano, but there are other options and I'm going to cover some of those today. So option number one is that you simply dig down to the oil/magma biome and you set up a little operation like this: a vacuumed out room, a pool of magma, and then a liquid pump with this tile right here covered by some sort of liquid. In this case we're using naphtha, but then magma beneath it. And the idea of this setup is that this pump is going to turn on because this counts as enough liquid to turn it on, right? It's in the range that it cares about, which is basically the two tiles that it's in right here. But it's going to pump everything from these tiles around it, including this one beneath it to the left. So we're going to be able to pump out magma without having this liquid pump, which is currently at 20.6 degrees. This pump is going to be able to pump out the magma without being in thermal contact with the magma, because this is a vacuumed out room. And then with insulation for our insulated liquid pipes, we're going to be able to pump that wherever we want. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to have a little liquid filter here. This liquid filter is going to separate back out our sort of starter fluid, right, and plop it back down where it began. And then the rest of the fluid is going to go up, in this case, to some metal refineries, which will kind of highlight the next point that I have to make. So let's go ahead and go to power here. Conductive wire, just grab some niobium, doesn't matter. You can make this out of anything. Hook it up like so, and off we go. So if we look at the plumbing here, I've set this to filter out the naphtha, right? We're sending all the magma that hasn't lost any temperature, right? 1726.9, this is 1726.9. No transfers occurred at all because these pipes are perfectly insulated and none of these things interact with the fluids that are in them. And we're pumping all this out to become the coolant of a metal refinery. Now, in the build that we had with sour gas, you could just be pumping out this magma to go sit on your heating element, right? That's perfectly fine too, but you might want to do something a little bit hotter, and there are a lot of different options, right? So when we run this metal refinery, let's go ahead and queue up one of this steel here. Steel being the recipe that will transfer the most heat to the contents of this metal refinery. Right, when we have, this is also in a vacuumed out room, by the way, and this tile needs to be insulated, but other than that, you're fine. We'll have someone run this refinery. I've put some materials in here for them to make steel. And we'll see that once it's done, we're going to have hotter magma come out. Maybe I'll slow down the speed a little bit to make it more clear. Oh, he ran off. Otto, get back in there. I know you don't have oxygen, but we're trying to demonstrate something here, Otto. Anybody else? Maybe I crank up this priority. While we wait for our duplicants to do that, this metal refinery will add a lot of heat to whatever liquid we're using as our coolant here. In this case, magma. We can take that hotter magma and then use it to warm up something else and get it to its melting point if we want to. As long as we don't go above the point where the magma boils off into rock gas, we're fine. And so we're able to set up various things where we can melt down. So here's this magma coming out. It's now at 1960.8 degrees Celsius. I think that's around a 230 degree increase. The exact numbers are going to vary depending upon your coolant and its specific heat capacity and the recipe that you're doing. Technically speaking, it is they're going to add enough heat to it to cover 80% of the heat cost, so to speak, of melting whatever metal it is that you're producing. Right, so the melting point of the metal that you're producing is relevant, and of course the specific heat capacity of the fluid that you're using is relevant. The lower the specific heat capacity, the higher the temperature increase, etc. Magma has a fairly good specific heat capacity for a fluid of 1. If we just go to the properties here, a lot of others have much lower specific heat capacities. It's more typical to see something below 0.5 and oftentimes below 0.2. So this is good. And we can just chain this process if we like to, right? So here we're going to see that this metal refinery is going to fill up with coolant. It's a weird thing to call it. But the 400 kilograms of coolant that we used in this operation are now going to go to this metal refinery. And we can go ahead and once this thing is done getting its magma, we can go ahead and say queue up another order for iron to steel, right? And if we want to increase the temperature by a little bit less, of course, we could do an operation other than steel. We could do copper or gold, which is a fairly small temperature increase. Right, there are options available to us. I think tungsten might be the smallest one, turning wolframite into tungsten. So we have some ability here to affect how much of a temperature increase so we get and kind of fine tune it so that we don't send this into a gaseous state. But then what we can do is we can take this coolant and we can either loop it back into the metal refinery or back even back into itself, right? Come on, finish your operation here. Let's make sure this is going as well. We can either loop it back into itself and continue heating it, right, and use that as our sort of our heating fluid, our working fluid, or we can straight up just dump it out into an area, right, like so, and then have the choice of either pumping it out if we decide that the temperature is such that we want to do that, or we can just, if I didn't have this insulated tile here, we could have it heat up a heating plate on which we have placed other things that we want to melt. And because we can get to much higher temperatures than just the boiling point of rock, right, which is where the rock turns into magma, we can kind of ladder our way up to whatever metal we want, right, using this exact same process. Just using the results of this, which is now at 2194.7 degrees Celsius, we can heat it up further. We can use this to heat up other things and melt them down, things that have higher boiling points, and continue this process. You also have the option, instead of using magma as your initial coolant, if you don't want to do this trick because you find this a little bit exploity, one of the things that you can do is just use a glass forge. A glass forge, if I go to plumbing here, is going to output molten glass at a temperature of, I believe it's 2200 degrees Celsius. So either 2200 degrees Celsius or 2200 degrees Kelvin. Either way, you can get molten glass as your input and skip this sort of pump trick. Obviously, you wouldn't then want to dump it on the ground because then you're going to have a hard time kind of recovering it if it's not at the temperature that you want for your heating plate. In this room, you'd also probably want to put something like an auto sweeper to, if this solidifies, if it cools off enough in that process, you can get rid of it that way. Right? There's a lot of things that you can do. But you can start off with molten glass as your coolant. The downside there is that molten glass has a specific heat capacity of 0.2, so you're going to have to be a little bit more careful in terms of heating it up. You don't want it to reach its vaporization point, and also it's going to give less heating because it has less heat to give. It stores less heat. Its specific heat capacity is lower. So that's one option, pumping magma directly out, pumping either molten glass or magma into your metal refinery and then heating it up even further, right? This started at 1726.9 and now it's 2194.7, right? We could continue this process and heat it up further. We can use that to heat up other metals and get other molten stuff. And there's also one neat thing. You can take something like a kiln, or really any building that doesn't have an overheat temperature, and you can use it to melt it down and get the molten material that way, just straight up. So in this case, I have a kiln that I have heated to 24.22 degrees Celsius. And I believe the melting point, 26.9 degrees Celsius. Again, this is a vacuumed out room so that there's no heat transfer here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to order one more bit of refined carbon here. And this thing is going to melt. And there are a couple ways that you can set this up. One way is with this auto sweeper and conveyor loader. I would set this conveyor loader to grab coal and basically say, look, when this coal drops, just pick it up. And we don't necessarily need to have mesh tiles here. We could just have more insulated tiles, and we would get the molten steel right here, right? Alternatively, we can just have these mesh tiles, and I believe, if I've done this right, the steel will just melt through and end up here. Steel is a good material to use for this process because unlike, say, wolframite, which melts in tungsten but melts at a temperature that is actually below the melting point of tungsten, steel melts at 24.269, but it doesn't re-solidify until about 1,000 degrees. So we saw there, this mesh tile got heated up as the liquid steel passed through it, right? or actually, I think what happened is that briefly the liquid steel was in contact with the coal that had come out of our kiln, because that was part of its contents. It was processing coal. It came into contact with that coal. The coal also came into contact with this gold amalgam and heated it up. And so this steel lost a little bit of temperature, and this gold amalgam got heated up a little bit. But it's still at a very hot temperature. And then we can use this same trick to pump it into a metal refinery and use the metal refinery to heat it up even further. We can boil steam, or boil steel if we like, using this process. From steel, we can get to tungsten. We can get to anything, basically, using this setup. A few notes on this. Right here, we could just build another kiln and get more material down here. We could have a pump set up here. There's a bunch of options that we have for this whole process. But a couple options on this little pump trick that we have up here. These aren't in thermal communication with much of anything, right? This is in vacuum, and this presumably could be in the room with vacuum. But they will generate heat, right? A liquid pump, while it's pumping, is going to generate 2 kDTUs. Does it say anywhere how much heat it outputs? Well, it should output roughly 2 kilodTUs per second that it's running, right? That heat will eventually accumulate in this liquid pump. Likewise, this liquid filter produces, I think, 1 kDTU per second. So these parts need to be cooled eventually. The trick is that this liquid filter doesn't have to be in a vacuumed out room, because it doesn't have to be anywhere near any of these fluids. So you can just put it in a cooled area. This pump right now is at 27.6, but over time it will cool off as the air around it cools it off. I don't know, this air appreciably colder than it, so it's not cooling down, right? The air around it is 27.6. So I'm not really showing that off very well, but there we go, 27.5. Thank goodness, it ticked down. You can cool it off just normally like this. The liquid pump, if you want to keep that cool, the trick is that you want to have actually somewhere in this loop, basically between this part where it gets filtered out and where it gets pumped back in, you'd like it to cool down to a more temperate temperature. That way it'll keep this liquid pump cool, right? That's the trick there if you want to keep this pump cool. But yeah, that's sort of the setup for creating some extreme heat. You can take building like a kiln, which doesn't have an overheat temperature but produces heat, and have it just melt itself. And we have some steel here, which we can use as coolant, so to speak, in our metal refinery. Or we could just run in molten glass from a glass forge. We can pump magma straight out. There are a lot of things that you can do, and these, if used in sequence with one another, right? You use the molten steel to melt tungsten, and then use the tungsten as coolant, so to speak, in your metal refinery, right? You can get to pretty much whatever temperature you want. I mean, within reason, I guess. You can get to about 6,000 degrees Celsius. And there you kind of run into problems. Basically, everything needs to just be insulated tile and not absorb any heat, because everything will melt when it comes into contact with that temperature. But again, vacuums, insulated tiles, you have a lot of things that you can work with to manage that heat. And with little tricks like this, you don't need to actually have the liquid in contact with really anything but that insulation throughout its cycle. So just a quick sort of showcase of some of the options that you have in terms of heating. If you guys want a build, I guess hit me up in the comments on what exactly you want the build to accomplish. Right, if the goal is to like boil steel, I could probably set something up like that. But yeah, it's going to look a lot like this, right? With probably more metal refineries, more of these sort of rooms, more heat exchanger things, and just we're going to ladder our way to higher temperatures if you want higher temperatures. Again, simplest solution might just be to use this little pump trick, pump up some magma from the bottom, use that as your makeshift volcano, and run the system off of that. Lots of options again. Kilns, all sorts of things that produce heat in this game. Generating heat is pretty straightforward. Okay, that's it for this, a guide to sort of really high heat applications. Hope it was helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.